Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, and welcome to this webinar on repression and political violence in China, sponsored by the Miller Center and the National Security Policy Center here at the University of Virginia. I'm Phil Potter. I'm a senior fellow at the Miller Center, founding director of the National Security Policy Center, and professor of politics. And I'm incredibly excited to have this panel with really wide-ranging experience to talk about these issues at the intersection of domestic and international security for China and the global implications of that question. We have with us Sheena Chestnut-Greitens. She is associate professor at the LBJ School at UT Austin, author of Dictators and Their Secret Police, and a forthcoming book on North Korean authoritarianism, which I don't believe is out yet, but she can check me on that if that is incorrect when the time comes, but we're all eagerly awaiting that one. We have Naima Green-Riley, who is assistant professor at Princeton University, former Foreign Service officer at Department of State, and brings wide-ranging experience, specializes in Chinese foreign policy, public diplomacy, and public information. And we have Paul Hare, who is a career public servant in the intelligence community, worked extensively on the Presidential Daily Briefing staff, National Intelligence Officer for East Asia, and so a long-standing expert and observer of this region and China in particular. And so we're going to be bringing together clearly a wide-ranging bit of experience here. And then finally, last but certainly not least, we have Chen Wang, who is assistant professor at University of Idaho and co-author of a recent book with me, Zero Tolerance, which is available from Cambridge University Press, which is sort of going to broadly structure this conversation, but we're really leaning on these experts for their views rather than simply a rehash of this book. The panel is intentionally a wide-ranging conversation around sort of a central piece of the puzzle that we explore in the book, which is, why is China willing to incur the substantial costs in terms of repression that they do? And we mean costs in terms of international prestige and their diplomatic position, actual physical costs in terms of the amount of money it truly takes to engage in this level of repression, and domestic legitimacy costs in terms of displacement of people, in terms of public opinion, whether we can see that or not. But what does this tell us about Chinese priorities domestically, Chinese priorities internationally, and how we might react to those moving forward, both in the United States and globally? So we're going to go in the order of the panel. And so I'm going to kick it over to Sheena first for your sort of opinion and opening thoughts, and particularly given your expertise, your thoughts on the intersection of China's international security and its domestic security priorities. And so we're going to sort of have each of the panelists give a few minutes in terms of opening remarks. Then we'll move to a little bit of dialogue between the panelists. And then finally, we'll be taking questions from the online audience. So please, at this point, as things occur to you, start putting questions forward in the chat, and we'll gather those up and answer as many of them as we possibly can. So with no further ado, Sheena, please, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, first, congratulations to both of you on the publication of this book. It is really a sophisticated, both theoretical and empirical treatment of political violence in China that places it in comparative and international context, and really tries to be rigorous about understanding what is unique about political violence in Xinjiang, and what are things that we can either learn from the sort of broader literature and scholarly knowledge of political violence, and then what does China have to teach us about that broader comparative perspective. So, the book is terrific. So congratulations to you both. I guess what I wanted to do is to start with the question that you raised, which is, why is Xinjiang such a focus, and where does it fit in the broader security thinking of the senior leadership of the Chinese Communist Party? And I do think that this has changed a bit under Xi Jinping. Xinjiang has always been a core interest. It has been a serious security concern for the CCP, really since the CCP took control of China during the revolution. But I think there has been a shift under Xi Jinping, partly because Xi Jinping promulgated in 2014 something that he calls the comprehensive national security concept. And I'm actually trying to finish a book on this now, so I will endeavor to not make the academic mistake of talking your ears off about the thing that I'm currently sort of doing a deep dive on. But this comprehensive national security concept contained a lot of strands of thought and ideas that had been in Chinese thinking about security for a long time. But it systematized, codified those concepts, elevated them to a very senior level in party doctrine. And I do think has as a result had really consequential shifts on Chinese law, policy, and behavior in the security realm. So that Chinese sources often translate this as the comprehensive national security concept or total national security concept, but it can equally be translated as state security concept. And that's really important because if you look at it, it is first and foremost a regime security concept as China's security strategy. It is the core of that strategy is what the CCP calls political security, which it then defines as the security of China's socialist system, the authority of the Central Committee with Xi Jinping at the core. So it is fundamentally about preserving regime security and the CCP's ability to rule the Chinese political and social system. That to get to how Xinjiang fits in this, that security concept sees internal and external security as very, very closely connected. Again, long history in Chinese thinking about security threats, of seeing these threats as connected. But Xi Jinping refers to them as sort of interlocking and says they can be mutually activated. And one of the things that we saw in some of the papers that were released, and the book talks about kind of both the predecessor policies and the consequences of some of Xi Jinping's thinking, is that he really defined Xinjiang as a test case for the comprehensive national security concept. It was one of the first places where he tried to apply this framework and actually turn it into concrete policy choices. And the result was the security buildup that we've seen in Xinjiang, large amounts of spending, augmented police recruitment, an attempt to portray the threat of violence in Xinjiang in particular ways to the rest of the Chinese domestic audience, the rest of the Chinese population, which I think your book does a fantastic job of drawing out. And I'm not going to go into that sort of piece of the book right now, but I hope we can talk about it today because I think it's a really important contribution. But that escalation really seems to be born of this idea that there was a real risk of destabilization, that there was a real concern about political violence in Xinjiang, that the old approaches were broken. One of the things we see under the comprehensive national security concept is that the CCP used to talk, at least implicitly, as if development would produce security. And so if the focus was on development and you could just, bring Xinjiang up to the same level of development as much of the rest of China, the security threats would resolve themselves. And Xi Jinping has explicitly rejected that premise and said, no, there are two wheels on one cart, two wings on one bird. There's a couple different metaphors, or security is the prerequisite now for development. And that, again, has implications for both China's domestic and its foreign security policy and development policy as well. So I think that if you look at where this intense focus on Xinjiang comes from, that comprehensive national security concept and its way of treating the nexus between internal and external is really an important place to start. The other piece is that the concept is hyper-preventative. And so sort of old approaches of being reactive were considered explicitly insufficient. And so the party has done a lot, and a lot of the securitization and the attempt to do re-education is seen as a preventive form of addressing potential security threats. I'm going to try to stop there because I'd like to get other comments and perspectives on the table before we come back to that. But I think that that's really at the core of what we see in Xinjiang. And a big part of the backdrop to the things that you document so clearly in the book. So I'll pause there. I have a few more thoughts, but I'll wait till the discussion to maybe add them if they're relevant. Thanks so much again.
No, much appreciated. And, I'm already sensing that we may need to get the gang back together at some point with a little bit more than an hour to discuss. And I would certainly be excited about that because this is indeed a rich topic. Naima, over to you, if you don't mind, for your opening thoughts, and particularly sort of given your expertise what all of this tells us about China's evolving diplomatic priorities.
Sure. Well, I come to this issue from the perspective of someone who thinks about public diplomacy and public relations. And so I want to talk a little bit about how political repression might be affecting China's public image, how Chinese policymakers may be thinking about those two things in relationship to each other. So when I talk about public diplomacy, when I write about public diplomacy, really what I'm talking about is how China and how other countries try to position themselves in the outside world, or how the Chinese government tries to build an image of China within the publics of other countries. And so this is a panel about repression, but China's public imaging is mainly not about human rights, right? It's not about repression. It certainly wouldn't reference repression unless to say that others were accusing China of doing so. Much of China's public outreach, public diplomacy, public messaging tends to focus on things like the leadership stance of the Chinese government and looking for opportunities to cast China as a leader in emerging fields. Chinese culture, often ancient culture, promoting investment opportunities in China, criticizing Western perspectives on international affairs and Western characterizations of China. And so when China does its public outreach, let's first recognize that those are the primary aims of China, are to shape the way that other folks are thinking about China internationally. And that particular aim is not necessarily unique. It's one that many countries have in their public outreach strategies and their public diplomacy strategies to try and have an impact on how people in different parts of the world are thinking about their countries. China does public outreach, and part of it is public diplomacy, but part of it is not, right? So part of China's public outreach is trying to impact general publics in other countries. Part of China's public outreach is focused on publics, but particular segments of publics. And often within the Chinese context, we're talking about reaching out to members of the Chinese diaspora. Part of China's public outreach is actually not public diplomacy. It's focused on elite diplomacy, so trying to reach members of political groups or business elites in different countries. Part of China's outreach is really just plain old diplomacy. It's trying to have an impact on government representatives in other countries. And so when China does its public outreach, ultimately, I think that China's true aim is to change the views of as many people or groups as possible that I've just mentioned, and to have a positive impact on how they are viewing China. And I think that what is unique about Chinese public diplomacy is that China has a unique political system, a unique system of governance that it then has to defend in the public sphere, right? And so let's go through and talk about what the impacts of political repression might be on some of those groups that I just mentioned. In the West, it's clear that among publics, among policymakers, among elites, on the whole, most people are simply unaccepting of many of the messages that are being promoted by Chinese policymakers. Many people are upset about political repression in China. Many people have access to news that criticizes what's happening within Chinese borders. And so that outreach has minimal effects on the public perceptions, or on the public perceptions, on the elite perceptions of China in Western countries. Some elites and government officials in other countries may like strongman tactics, right? And so if that's the case, then messaging that focuses on how policies that we're characterizing here as political repression, but are characterized by the Chinese government as maintaining social order or preventing terrorism, might actually have a persuasive effect. And so those countries might be interested in working with China and therefore be willing to reinforce Chinese narratives on repression itself. The calculus for those states, many of whom are authoritarian, many of whom have been criticized globally for their own human rights records, is very different. And what's been surprising to, I think, a lot of people in places like the US is the extent to which even countries that have Muslim majority populations have been willing to work with China in the public sphere, have been willing to reinforce Chinese messaging on political repression, and have been willing to actually cooperate with Chinese security forces in, for example, repatriating people to China who have run afoul of Chinese standards of political governance. I think that often narratives about human rights are often highly manipulated and censored by elites in those types of countries as well, right? So when we think about how publics in countries that are authoritarian in nature, that are working with China, are perceiving this issue, that's going to be highly determined, I think, by the extent to which they're able to hear about issues of political repression in China. In many cases, stories about political violence or repression in China are not going to be appearing in their domestic news environment. They're either going to get messaging about this from Chinese sources or from sources that are basically reinforcing the messages of Chinese sources, or they're not going to hear about much at all. And so I think that some of the messaging that's done around issues like treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang is intended by the Chinese government to reach populations before they get word of what is happening in those places from sources that are going to, of course, be quite opposed to those types of actions. And so when we look at the effects of the messaging, we have to think about the overall proportion of critical messaging and positive messaging that different communities are receiving. We have to think about how their own host governments are treating these issues and the stance of those governments towards the Chinese government. And then we can start to understand why in many parts of the world, we're also seeing people who aren't necessarily upset about political repression in China. Overall, during the conversation, I hope that we can talk about what some of the costs are and what some of the costs aren't of political repression on the way that China is being treated in the international sphere. I think that there certainly are costs. There are costs in those places that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, costs in places where people are appalled at stories of political repression. But I think that in some places, those costs aren't coming through as heavily. And so the context, the places where people are receiving the messaging and their political environments highly, I think, affects people's reactions to what's happening within China's borders. And I'll stop talking there.
No, thank you for that. And I do hope we can come back to this question of costs. It seems like something that I think everybody wants to get a little bit more deeply into. Paul, let me push it over to you now for opening remarks. And again, as I said, sort of as a long standing observer of this region, I'm particularly curious in sort of how you slot these events in alongside what is a substantial history of interaction, obviously. And so is this sort of a structural break? I think a lot of folks, when they saw the media coverage around what was going on, suddenly were like, oh my goodness, this is a very different story than what we've seen before. But there are also, as has already been raised, these threads of continuity with longstanding interest. And so I just would be very appreciative of your reaction to sort of this whole situation.
No, well, Phil, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate with such a very impressive group of scholars here. And just listening to the way you framed the question and listening to Sheena and Naima, there's such a web of issues that can be explored here. I think what I'll do, I'll just start with a few comments that are kind of key to my reading of the book, but certainly lend themselves and dovetail a lot with the things that we've already heard and some of the issues that I think we'll come back to. First and foremost, I was impressed very much by the book, especially because it directly addresses the Chinese mindset on the Xinjiang issue and why the CCP feels it needs to do what it's doing there. And it does so without either dismissing the Chinese perspective or validating it. What I mean by that is that the prevailing public narrative on Xinjiang seems to be that Beijing is committing genocide against a non-existent or imaginary threat because that's the nature of the CCP. That's a very simplistic characterization, but in the current U.S. policy debate over China, it's politically difficult to suggest that Beijing is responding in any measure to an actual terrorist or separatist threat, or that foreign support for Uyghur extremists is in any way a valid concern for the CCP. On each of these issues, I think the book does an excellent job of parsing the extent to which the threat is real and the extent to which it has been exaggerated, and it clearly has by the Chinese to serve Beijing's purposes. The bottom line, and I think this is what you focused on, and it gets back to some of the points that Sheena made, is that you clearly show how Beijing's approach to Xinjiang and to so many other issues is driven primarily or in large measure by a genuine sense of insecurity, not just the fact of authoritarianism. And this is the point that Sheena has done such great groundbreaking work on in their broadening definition of national security, or maybe national insecurity. And you do that while still describing what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang as a monstrosity. On the question you just raised about where this fits into the continuity, I thought your periodization of the history of China's approach to Xinjiang is really fantastic. And I was especially taken by your discussion of the period since 1990, because it completely coincides with my own recollection of developments in Xinjiang and how Beijing dealt with them and responded to them while I was monitoring these issues from within the intelligence community. That includes the impact of the Soviet collapse, the subsequent dashed hopes of the Uyghurs, which started leading to incremental rises in violence, the way Beijing played the Islamic extremism issue diplomatically after 9/11, and going on from there. So I commend you on the historical backdrop as you framed it. I was also very impressed by the persuasiveness and boldness of several of the judgments, which have broader implications beyond that issue in the book, especially the conclusion that Beijing tends to pursue internationalization of these issues only when it sees both domestic and external benefits to doing so. And echoing some of the points that Naima just made, I thought your discussion of the attitude of many Muslim countries was very insightful, that their relatively subdued response to developments in Xinjiang is related not just to their economic relationships with China, but to broader international perceptions, including, and as you note in the book, their discomfort with what they perceive or see as Washington's more unilateralist approach to counterterrorism. In that regard, I very much like the observation that Beijing's approach to Xinjiang is a strong indicator that the Chinese have all but declared the end of a period of strategic opportunity that Jiang Zemin had announced more than 20 years ago. The end of that, given what they perceive as the redirection of an adversarial U.S. approach back to China. And this applies to issues not just in Xinjiang, but across the board. With regard to Xinjiang, I liked the succinctness of your bottom line judgment that the cycle of violence and repression there is headed for a break. You say very directly, and I think very persuasively, that a release is nearly inevitable. Finally, your conclusions in the book included what I thought were some very important counterintuitive findings, which I think echo, again, a little bit what Naima just said about the perceptions of other Muslim countries, particularly your judgment that Beijing's repression in Xinjiang might actually advance the CCP's legitimacy with some audiences, and specifically this notion that the Chinese approach to the issue has weakened Washington's ability to restrain Beijing, partly because of other countries' acknowledgement of CCP concerns about political violence in Xinjiang and their unwillingness to challenge Beijing's approach to dealing with it. I would only add one mildly dissenting thought for the sake of discussion. This also gets back to something Sheena said about Xi Jinping's promulgation back in 2014 of the comprehensive national security concept. I mean, you discuss this issue of the personalization of CCP policy towards Xinjiang under Xi in the book, and it's clear that the concentration camps, if you want to call them that, are his signature response to this perceived threat. But I would love to get into a more in-depth discussion of the extent to which the evolution of Beijing's approach to Xinjiang was also a product of factors other than Xi's leadership, domestic and international factors that were already pushing the party toward greater feelings of insecurity and toward a more draconian approach to dealing with some of these issues. My own prejudice, and I think you mentioned this, is that, I think there's a lot of continuity and evolution in Chinese policy, both domestic and foreign, over the past 20 years, rather than dramatic changes that have been exclusively attributable to Xi. In any case, I just think the uniqueness of the Xi factor is a really interesting and important one that's subject to more discussion and debate. I'll leave it at that for now, and look forward to further conversation here.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Chen, let me push it over to you for your opening thoughts, reactions, and obviously ability to kind of pull some of these points back to the book a little bit or to your ongoing work in this area.
Sure thing. Thanks, Phil. It's always good to be back to UVA, even just virtually. So I thought I'm the first. So actually, I prepared my opening thought purely about the book. But I find that surprisingly, a lot of the talks and the points shared by the other panelists are closely tied to our book. Okay, so in many different aspects. So Phil and I started, this project fairly early, around late 2014, early 2015. I think back then this was whole political violence, repression, and even Xinjiang region was not a big thing for either the mass media or the political science scholarly circle in terms of both the Chinese politics literature, political violence literature, or the security literature in general. Okay, but looking back, ironically, just as Sheena pointed out, this time period was actually pretty critical and determining in shaping what we observe today in terms of the region's status quo. Okay, so Sheena mentioned that this was the year when the comprehensive national security concept was first brought up. But also this was the year or the time period where we observed several high-profile attacks in China, in different parts of China, in Xinjiang, and in Tiananmen Square, China, a railway station in Kunming. This was also the year, when the Chinese economy faced some headwinds. Okay, so 2014 was kind of the first year in decades when the GDP growth rate didn't really meet the target set at the beginning of that year. And a lot of China watchers, define 2014 as the year that China is changing their rhetoric about their economic growth mode. At least the official media is trying to describe China's economy from this high-speed growth to a high-quality growth. So that signals some of these domestic problems the Chinese leadership is facing. And also, that was the time of period when today's paramount leader, President Xi Jinping, was still. Sorry, it's too early. It's my alarm. So it's 7 o'clock. So that was also a period of time when today's paramount leader, Xi Jinping's only early in his tenure. Okay, so he's still pretty much in the process of consolidating his position. And at the same time, he's pretty sensitive to almost any signs of instability. Okay, so these factors together, I think it well explains the emergence of this zero tolerance for any instability, and this sense has been growing since then. Okay, so I think Sheena is also correct on the point that 2014-2015 marked a clear shift, a qualitative change in China's approach to actually not only Xinjiang, but also many domestic security and concerns and challenges. And that is a change from this more reactive approach in the past to a more preventive approach and that we observe today. I think a critical change that speaks specifically to Xinjiang was, in the past, this Uyghurs' grievance was largely interpreted as a developmental problem. Okay, so and that justifies this stick and a carrot approach that has been implemented for decades. So they believe that a strong policing presence, securitization, plus a continued commitment to promoting development in the region to reduce economic inequality can eventually solve the problem. But we saw a break from that approach in 2014, where I guess partly because of the emergence of this comprehensive national security concept, where political security has been elevated to the core position of this overall approach to national security, the authority began to perceive, interpret this entire Uyghurs' grievances and challenge as an identity challenge and an ideological challenge. Okay, so that justifies their change in approach in terms of shifting towards more active ethnic mingling, de-radicalization, and eventually re-education that we have today. Okay. So I guess on the foreign policy side, I want to respond a little bit to what Neema just brought up in terms of China's broader public diplomacy approach should really be, separated as two efforts. One is, as Neema said, they're trying to reach out and to build these diplomatic ties with political elites in other countries. And the public diplomacy efforts were primarily targeted on the Chinese diasporas in other countries. Okay, so this actually created a problem for the Chinese authority because, for many years after this Belt and Road Initiative, their investment in the local infrastructure, they were kind of saddened and surprised by the fact that the public opinion in many of these host countries were not very friendly towards the Chinese presence. Okay, so that creates this sense of caution. And what we find in terms of China's behavior in the foreign policy sphere when it comes to counterterrorism cooperation is that China has been treading very carefully. Okay, so it's not like their behavior domestically that is characterized by this bold and ambitious agenda. On the international stage, they've been very cautious, very selective, especially when it comes to the presence of PLA in those regions. I think that has something to do with the point that Neema pointed out there, right? So they're good at building this good relationship with political elites in those countries, but not quite good at building a good relationship with the public in the region. So they're kind of fearful and concerned of this potential backlash associated with this increasing presence of so many Chinese factors in the region, economic, political. So the military would be the last thing they want to show out there. I guess there are kind of two more broader implications that we can easily draw from this book. And I think this implication speaks to the nature of the Chinese regime today. Okay, so after so many years, the rise of China is no longer a hypothetical term. Okay, and everyone's talking about how China has become the second largest economy in the world. But what we find in terms of China's behavior in the domestic approach to deal with domestic political violence and international counterterrorism cooperation still reveals that this authority remains deeply cautious, risk-averse, and sensitive and insecure. Okay, and at the same time, I think this unique approach in terms of the massive repression against the Uyghur population reveals this broader change in China's interpretation of security threats. As Sheena said, it's more today about the ideological challenge and identity challenge that the party sees as critical to their regime survival and political security in general. Yeah. All right, I'm going to stop here, Phil. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Chen. So, one of the things that I want to come back to, because I think all of our panelists raised this in one form or another, was this question of costs. And one thing that sort of emerged in a more acute way since we finished the book is this idea that China may have economically, demographically, all sorts of ways sort of peaked, or at least be in rough waters. So a lot of the story that we develop is based on this notion that, 10% year-on-year rise forevermore was never in the cards, but had already ceased by, as a number of you have raised, a decade ago, perhaps. But I think very few of us necessarily foresaw the extent to which China would come out of COVID as wounded as it seems to have, economically speaking. And to me, anytime the overall pie is not doing as well as you forecast it would, all of these issues of costs become much more acute than they otherwise would be. And so I thought I might return sort of to the panelists in the same order. And, Sheena, in your own work, I know you've talked extensively about sort of the risks and costs that the regime is willing to incur domestically and internationally for the sake of security. How are you thinking about that now in the context of these diminishing costs? And then Naima, kind of over to you on the diplomatic question that you raised about that sort of cost acceptance question, and then we'll go to Paul on this one as well. And at that point, I'll open it up to questions from the audience. Sheena, over to you, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think that in many ways here, again, Xinjiang is sort of a test case of broader trends that we've seen emerge in China since the 2014 benchmark that you laid down as a transition point in policy in Xinjiang. And the CCP, frankly, just part of this security concept and the idea that security is the precondition for development means that the regime seems to be willing to tolerate much higher, at least short-term costs in order to achieve that security. Now, the bet may be that will actually lead to more stable or sustainable long-term economic footing, because China won't be as sort of at the mercy of the international environment or international actors who could economically penalize China for political or security behavior. So this may be a calculation of short-term versus long-term economic interest, but it's hard to say that for sure. What we see is that the CCP is pretty unquestionably willing to tolerate some pretty high costs, and I would put those in three buckets. One we've already mentioned, and I think Naima spoke to it very, very eloquently, about the sort of, at least among certain parts of the world, not uniformly, absolutely, but that there's a reputational cost internationally for Chinese behavior in Xinjiang. Then there's the question of the economic costs. And then there's the question of whether or not this intense suppression and sort of securitization in Xinjiang is actually sort of bottling up or concealing resentment, right? We know that people engage in some level of preference falsification in authoritarian political environments. So I think there's actually a potential risk that there are even domestic costs that the CCP has not fully had to bear yet. It's had to bear the direct physical and financial costs domestically, but we know that long-term sort of resentment of repression can build up silently or in concealed ways, and then there can be a cascade, right? And the CCP is aware of this in a lot of contexts, right? It paid great attention to this dynamic in the color revolutions, in the Arab Spring, et cetera. So this is a dynamic that's on their radar. But at least in the conversations I've had and the sources that I've read, the benchmark for successful policy in Xinjiang that the CCP has set for itself and that security officials, party state officials have set for themselves is no large-scale attacks in X number of years. And consistently, that is the basically sole metric used to justify, defend, and sort of adjudicate the success of the policy. And so this is a case where I actually think the key performance indicators and the rise of security is equal to or superseding developmental performance indicators for local officials and for the CCP writ large, really means that as long as there are no attacks, this policy, what the CCP is doing will be considered a success. That doesn't mean it's static, right? We've already seen debates since the time the book came out about, is the nature of re-education shifting? Is the movement of people in and out of these facilities changing? As surveillance infrastructure gets more embedded and advanced, will the re-education process change in different ways? Is it already changing? Right? These are all really important empirical questions. And so I'm not suggesting that CCP policy will be static. But right now, there's, at least in public rhetoric, an unwillingness to say that the policy has been anything other than a pretty unqualified success, and sort of an insensitivity in the economic sense of that term to these other costs that I think we as outsiders often tend to focus on. And the CCP seems very, very focused on this one performance indicator that is telling them that the policy has worked. So that's really how I see it. And in that sense, I think in some ways, Xinjiang was kind of the canary in the coal mine, to use a popular phrase, in that, we seem to see this willingness to absorb greater economic and international costs in the name of security kind of across the board in other areas of Chinese security policy, whether it was the management of COVID-19 or the regulation of foreign businesses and other elements of foreign presence. Right? The idea that, okay, well, if we think it's going to make the CCP or the party state more secure, then we're willing to sort of tolerate these costs at a higher level than we were before. Actually seems to be true not just in Xinjiang, but also sort of more broadly in China. Again, that could change at any minute, because I think the policy making process has become a little less predictable as it's become more personalized and more opaque, frankly, with the shut off of certain sources of information and interaction between the US and China, or between China and the outside world. So, anything I'm saying today should not be taken as a prediction in perpetuity, because it could easily change or evolve tomorrow. I think these things are condition sensitive. But I think Xinjiang as an example of the willingness to sort of use an internal security metric, and have that override all of these other elements of cost and trade-off is actually, a pretty telling example and indicative of a broader trend in China.
I think that's really well put. I mean, one of the things that we struggle with, and I think one of the hardest questions, is sort of how to tally up these costs that we know are accruing but go largely unobserved, and particularly since they're costs that feel like they should be pushing not toward a steady transition, but perhaps toward a break point. Observed costs with a break, unobserved costs rather, but moving toward a break point is a really tough kind of scientific question. Chenna, do you want to add a point on this?
Yeah, I just want to further second Sheena's points, because one of the crucial components of the comprehensive national security concept was they're trying to slightly change the rhetoric about the relationship between stability maintenance and development. Okay, so in the past, stability maintenance, internal security has been used to justify development. But now the new comprehensive national security concept is trying to elevate security or stability to the same kind of importance priority as development. And that really means that the authority is more willing to tolerate any development related costs for maintaining stability and security. Yeah.
Thanks. A similar question, you raised a similar thing on the diplomatic side, that there are these sort of mounting unobserved costs. I wonder if we might kind of turn back to you on that issue.
Sure, and I don't think that all of the costs of, for example, the Xinjiang issue are unobserved, right?
Sure.
There are some clear costs that China has, faced because of repression in Xinjiang. There have been sanctions from the US, the UK, the European Union, Canada against China. There's been condemnation in public fora. There have been diplomatic costs, the boycott of the Winter Olympics, at least official representation at the Winter Olympics in China, citing repression in Xinjiang. Countries that have cooperated with China. So I mentioned before that some countries had cooperated with China in different ways surrounding issues of political repression. One example would be that last year, Saudi Arabia was found to have detained 4 Uyghur people and was going to repatriate them to China. This got out in popular press. A number of organizations rallied a lot of international support against it. And Saudi Arabia received so much blowback that at least in the short term, it postpone the flight, right, of these individuals going back to China. They didn't take off. And so there are costs that are there and that are observable from certain parts of the globe. I think what I have observed within Chinese elite circles, though, is a feeling that criticism of the Xinjiang issue is the same as criticism of human rights issues related to China for many, many years. And so there is, to some extent, a narrative, I think, within China that I think many elites actually have internalized. So they really believe that the US and other Western countries will always criticize Chinese human rights, and that's something to be expected. And if that's something to be expected, then we can move on because China has other reasons for doing these things that are important to China's overall security. And the fact that condemnation surrounding Xinjiang emerged at the same time as a sort of wholesale policy shift within the United States, where the two countries became, in their diplomatic relations, much more antagonistic towards each other on a whole range of issues, may have obscured the extent to which this issue is particularly concerning to many people in the West, and has caused a particular sense of outrage, of concern, of feelings of just like not being able to understand what's going on. And so I think that there might be a little bit of a grappling with the sense that on the one hand, there's a real feeling within China that it's always going to be criticized for these things. And on the other hand, I think the Chinese elites must be aware that these issues rank really high in public opinion. When I do surveys, I see it all the time. These are really, really concerning, seriously concerning. It's not a political front, for people in the West, for the people who are making policy in the West, but also members of the public. And I'll end by saying this: if there is that recognition that there is this heightened sense of concern about what's going on in Xinjiang, there is a heightened sense of concern also about Chinese support for what's happening in Russia right now, for the war in Russia. These types of issues are qualitatively different from many who are in the West, at least. Then there also must be some grappling happening right now in the recognition that China can't completely alienate people in the West, right? China's at a point economically when it needs to be able to cooperate to some extent. It's at a point politically where it still needs to be able to have some sort of conversation with folks who are in countries that are not just the United States, but in Europe as well, Australia, typically Western nations. And so I think that to some extent there still is a desire within public diplomacy products to try and make some sort of a argument that there are other reasons for this, but I don't know that they'll work in those communities. It may not get China to the point that it wants to get to. And so I think that leaders must be grappling with the sense of realizing, right, that this is going to affect their ability to just make connections with people who are quite worried and concerned about this issue. And like Chen said, I think that there has been a sense of caution for that reason in certain areas. And I think that will have to be reflected in future actions of China as well.
I think it's a fascinating set of points. Thanks for that. And Paul, I might ask you to sort of react to hopefully not my mangling of Naima's good points, but what I sort of saw as a really important insight in what she just said, which is, there on the one hand is this sort of clash of core interests, core values going on here, where things that are dearly held in the West are incongruent with things that are crucial to the CCP. At the same time, I think there's a lot of concern that I've had, I know others on this panel have had, that we've taken away almost all the off-ramps. If they're going to be criticized for everything all the time, it becomes a story where you start not bothering to appeal to human rights, things along those lines. You may as well develop a reputation for strength and capability and even authoritarian aptitude or whatever it might be. I'm curious, sort of from your policy perspective, what do we do about that kind of Gordian knot, and how, kind of, as you put it earlier in your comments, how do we make them potentially feel the right kinds of costs in the right kinds of places that would change behavior in productive ways rather than unproductive ways? Easy one.
Well, it's an easy question, but the answer is that it's going to get harder to do that. Because if you go back, you can go back to the crackdown in Hong Kong, you can go back to Tiananmen Square in 1989, you can go back earlier than that. This is a regime that has demonstrated its willingness to accept diplomatic and reputational and even economic costs when it sees stability and security and control at stake. They will hunker down. And I think that this has always been reinforced when their economy started to slow down. To get back to your initial formulation of the question, I think we're going to see that tendency reinforced now. If they're, I mean, I'm not an economist, but the prevailing view seems to be that they're facing a slump. And when they do, that reinforces these tendencies. I think the countervailing factor, though, is that affects their calculus. Is the Chinese belief, and this is relatively new, that in spite of all of that, their international clout and leverage and influence still seems to put them in a position to score points against the United States. I mean, we talked earlier about the fact that they don't fear as much criticism from the global South and even the Muslim world on the Xinjiang issue, on any of these stability issues, because of their economic clout. But that, I think, is further reinforced by their perception that the United States is in relative decline. I mean, the Chinese clearly see multipolarization advancing in the world at the expense of the, post-war influence of the United States and its alliance network. I mean, and there's a lot of wishful thinking and overcalculation in their minds there. But when you look at the attitude of a lot of the rest of the world, the Chinese at least see opportunities there. That will both minimize not minimize, but somewhat mitigate the pressure that they're going to face externally, and the criticism and the costs they're going to have to pay, because they think they're still in a position to score some points internationally. And I think that we're going to see that element of the equation be very operative for the foreseeable future because of their perception of the trajectory of the global balance of power. So I think you're right. I mean, they've been grappling with what you described for 40 years. And it's been a balance sheet for that whole time. And I think that's the way I would characterize the way they currently see the balance sheet. Yeah, they're in real trouble internally. I mean, and they exaggerate, their fears. But they have legitimate fears, and that has always reinforced their readiness to accept costs. But they convince themselves that those costs are going to be less than they might have been because a lot of the rest of the world isn't going to try to exact those costs, and the United States and its allies and the containment coalition, as they perceive it, are in a lesser position because of that multipolarization to exact costs against China. So I think, my answer to your question is we should still be trying to do that. We should name and shame them. We should try to organize international resistance and criticism of what they're doing. But it's just getting harder because of both the reality and the perception of China's international clout.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I certainly agree that nothing is getting easier about this over time. We're beginning to run a little low on time. Let me ask a couple of additional questions from the audience to sort of, I'll kind of direct them to who I believe to know the most about these particular issues. So the first I'll send over to Sheena, which is, the question is essentially about to what extent is China exporting these repressive kind of security capabilities? What are they doing outside of this immediate conversation in terms of exporting these issues? That the questioner raised Venezuela as an example, but this is obviously a much larger story that you know a great deal about.
Yeah, it's a great question and actually empirically a little bit complicated. To me, the short answer is China exporting these tools? Yes. When I use export, I mean, is it supplying them? Is it forcing them on other countries? That's much, or imposing a particular system on other countries? That's a little bit less clear. Is it willing to supply them to countries that are interested and buyers who are willing to or find Chinese technologies useful for a range of purposes? Absolutely. So I have a project on China's export of surveillance technology, and things like Huawei's safe city platforms or the ZTE or other Chinese surveillance tech companies that have these specific platforms for policing and public security are in use somewhere in between 80 and 100 countries around the world. And so there's no question that these tools are being exported. The other thing is that China has clearly set itself up as a model on offer for people who are interested, or countries and leaders that are interested in its approach to what it calls building a safe China. So the Ministry of Public Security at one point partnered with the Foreign Ministry to bring in people from embassies in Beijing to kind of go through a demo of how the Ministry of Public Security does its work. That included both technology and tactics. And China has international police fora. So just last week or the week before, during the UN General Assembly, the Chinese Minister of Public Security, who keeps a really active international diplomatic schedule, he is not just an internal cop, he does a lot of foreign policy interfacing, hosted something called the Lianyungang Forum. It's now been renamed the Global Public Security Cooperation Forum or something like that. It's a group that gathers in China every year to talk about approaches to policing and international law enforcement cooperation. Xi Jinping told the Ministry of Public Security in 2017 to adopt a more global vision for state security work, and the Ministry of Public Security, which already had some international activity, did increase a lot of its public training and sort of cooperation activities across a range of different types of activities after that. So in the last 5 years, we've seen a more active Ministry of Public Security. Now, again, is that imposing where a host country or host government indicates it's completely unwelcome? Not necessarily. But it is, the Ministry of Public Security and these tools are definitely on offer to places that may or may not have a good sense of what the political costs might be. So a mayor in Latin America may think, hey, I've got a crime problem. I've got to control, violent criminal activity in the drug trade. This surveillance, this camera system seems like it might be really useful for that. Maybe I'll buy it for that reason. But we don't actually know yet what a lot of the side effects on things like human rights or democratic, particularly liberal democratic governance are going to be. So in terms of, is this something China is willing to supply and offer as a positive, what it frames as a positive model to the world in its public rhetoric and diplomatic sort of offerings? Yes, absolutely. The question is whether it's doing sort of the more coercive activities to try to get its model imposed in other places. I think the evidence for that is much weaker. But when I use the term exporting the tools of authoritarianism, I mean, are they willing to supply them? And I think in that case, the answer is pretty clearly yes.
Thanks for that. I'm going to be admittedly overambitious here and kick one question very briefly to Naima on the role of international NGOs in this broader story of China's diplomatic posture. And then quick closing words from Paul and Chen, and then unfortunately we'll be out of time at that point. So Naima, any thoughts on kind of the role of NGOs in this picture that you've painted for us?
Yes, and I think I can be pretty brief in my response here, because I think it's clear that a lot of the activism that has been done to raise awareness within publics about the more disturbing elements of Chinese political repression has sort of been through international NGOs. Often it is those organizations that are launching social media campaigns or circulating petitions that make people who often in publics wouldn't be paying attention to these issues otherwise, right? They might be more focused on like where they were going to get their latte in the morning. So that those people are aware of what's going on and are using their voices then to sort of spread the word. And so I think that much of the more public aspects of pushback against treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang has come through international NGOs, and also pushback on countries who have supported China in those efforts have also come from those types of NGOs.
Thank you for that. Yeah, certainly, it seems like the spotlight is maintained when between sort of, big news stories by these NGOs. So thanks for raising that. Paul, final thoughts?
Well, I would just reiterate the one point that I just made in my last comments. I think one of the biggest challenges we're going to be facing on this issue going forward is this issue of China's, despite all of its problems, China's calculus of its international leverage. And its perception that there is a receptive audience in various parts of the world to its worldview and its way of responding to the United States. I think that's one of the biggest components of the strategic competition that we're engaged in now.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you very much. Chen, close us out.
Yeah, so I think Xinjiang might be an extreme case in many aspects, but I think the guiding principle behind the Chinese behavior in Xinjiang and the dynamic there is more prevalent. Okay, so I think so national security is a term that is more visible today in China than any part of Chinese history, as far as I can recall. So now China has a National Security Day, Education Day, and they're more willing to bring even the Ministry of State Security into the public. They got their own WeChat accounts, so they periodically share some their own analysis, their perspectives. I think this change will have some profound implications, and in the near short term, I think we already see some of these consequences, which is this what you brought up earlier, this slower than expected economic growth after COVID. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that China is kind of breaking away from the pragmatism, which is the most essential factor to support China's economic growth in the past. Yeah.
Thanks to all of you. Clearly, this is a meaty topic. Clearly, we all need to meet up for many days to discuss all of the various facets of this, and then we would not be touching bottom even remotely. But thank you for sharing your expertise, and thank you for all the great work you do in this area. I think it's important, and I think we need more of it. So with thanks from the Miller Center, from the National Security Policy Center, and to our online audience, very much appreciate you being here. So we are signing off and complete. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.